So I'm very happy to be here, and I again want to thank my colleagues, Hector and Laura, for the invitation and for all the wonderful work we're doing together here. The International Seminar in Global History, I think, is the ideal setting for the way the study of history is moving. So what's happening here at San Marcos is on the cutting edge of how historians are beginning to understand that history cannot be boxed in, contained to nation states.
Mm-hmm. So the main concept, the basis of the main idea is that history can be contained, can be, no puede estar en una escátola, ¿no? No es algo fijo, algo que se puede limitar, pero es una conexión de muchos enlaces, ¿no? Muchos asuntos diferentes.
And I feel very honored to be a part of this seminar, because if you look at the list of historians who have spoken to this seminar,
so, agradece mucho a sí, el hecho que aquí han pasado muchos personajes importantes, muchas personas bien enteradas en asuntos históricos, entonces eso, ¿no?
So it's very flattering for me to be invited. I don't consider myself at the level of some of these historians who've been invited here. So it's quite an honor. And I think the work I'm going to present to you today is a very strange way to understand the history of empire and capitalism, because we're examining a subject, piracy, that capital and empire define themselves against.
Entonces, el objetivo final de esta charla es definir la piratería, ¿no? Como un elemento que hace parte también de la idea del capitalismo, ¿no? El concepto del capitalismo, y entra en el interior de lo que fue el imperio británico.
Okay. Well, we will begin the talk today with some stories about piracy in the Caribbean in the 17th century. But before I launch into that, I want to clarify some very important terms, because these terms are not just terms, they're concepts too, and they're confusing because they're so interconnected.
Entonces, una de las cosas que él quiere subrayar más que todos es el sentido de los términos, que no son simplemente términos, pero tienen un significado muy importante para entender lo que estamos diciendo en esta charla, ¿no? Entonces, términos que están conectados con la piratería, sobre todo. Veremos ahora qué más que piratería.
Okay, first term, piracy. Seemingly a simple concept and term to understand. So what is piracy? It's maritime, oceanic, high seas thievery. But it's also maritime thievery that attacks ships as well as coastal settlements, villages, towns, port cities, right? So it's coastal raiding and also stealing ships and their cargoes on the high seas. Since antiquity, since the beginning of Western notions of civilization versus savagery. Piracy is what civilization defined itself against. If you want, okay, so the Latin term, or the Latin phrase that described pirates was hostis humani generis, the common enemies of mankind. Pirates, because of the crimes they committed, were outside the boundaries of civilization, which made them barbarians and savages, who were criminals that any government could execute. For just one example, if you're looking to antiquity, to ancient Rome, for example, for philosophers defining piracy as beyond civilization, read Cicero's account of Pompey's clearing of the seas of pirates, which was one of Pompey's major achievements that vaulted him to power in the Roman Republic. Okay, so this is an old concept, pirates versus civilization. So fast forward in time from 40 AD to 1655. What we
Yes.
So what we see happening in the 17th century is this old definition of criminal savagery being redefined by empires, mostly the British, who are going to make piracy that they organize a technology of imperial expansion. So how does piracy, the criminal savagery of antiquity, become an early modern, legitimate form of political power?
Entonces, ¿cómo llega a ser algo que está en la ley, ¿no? Permitido por la ley, ¿no? Porque se habla de acts, ¿no? de leyes que permiten hacer esas cosas, ¿no?
So how do they do it? They change the name. Piracy, privateering. Privateering is simply state-sponsored piracy.
Entonces, el hecho que se inventaron, they invented, it's a wrong way to translate, but a new word, una nueva palabra para justificar, ¿no? Estos hechos fue privateering. Algo que tiene una otra etiqueta, pero no, a new label, but again the same idea.
So for the British Empire, privateering is a system of piracy that flourishes when the state gives mariners, seamen, sailors certificates, commissions, license, asiento, permission, to act like pirates against their foreign enemies in times of war.
Entonces, lo que pasa es que esos nuevos piratas pueden hacer lo que hacían antiguamente los piratas, pero tienen el permiso para hacerlo, ¿no? Entonces, esto es el hecho nuevo que justifica lo que pasa en esos países, en estos lugares, sobre todo en el Caribe, de lo que se habla hoy, donde se acudió, se hizo todo lo que antes la ley no podía permitir, pero debajo de esas nuevas leyes, ¿no?, que el gobierno inglés formuló.
So yesterday, I talked a lot about military conscription, the government forcing men into the army or into the navy to fight imperial wars. Military conscription became a technology of imperial expansion and capital accumulation. Piracy, becoming privateering, will perform the same function for the British, at the same time as military conscription becomes systematic.
También la conscripción, ¿no?, creo que se dice también en español, de los soldados, ¿no?, el reclutamiento de los soldados es algo que está conectado con la idea de la guerrilla, porque esos que nominalmente eran soldados al final se comportan como piratas en esos barcos, en esas embarcaciones inglesas, ¿no? Sobre todo en las rutas que vemos aquí.
Okay, so yesterday also we talked a lot about Jamaica. We talked about the British conquest of Spanish Jamaica and how it became a British colony. Why Jamaica? Why was it an object of conquest? Okay?
Entonces se habla en particular, y ayer se ha hablado en particular de Jamaica. ¿Por qué Jamaica y no otros lugares, otras islas? ¿Por qué Jamaica?
Look at this global chart of the Spanish treasure fleet as it traverses the world, trading gold and silver mined in New Spain and Peru, trades it westward to Manila in the Philippines in exchange for spices. The gold and silver bullion is also brought back to Europe, where it will be invested and used as sort of capital accumulation for the Spanish Empire. This increase in the world's supply of gold and silver is revolutionizing the global economy. Look where Jamaica is. Jamaica, right south of Cuba, is at the choke point, the center of where these treasure fleets are coming back and forth across the Atlantic and into the Caribbean. Havana is like the treasure fleets always anchor in Havana to provision and to get ready for the rest of the journey. Jamaica, being so close to Cuba, makes it an ideal base for privateering. So when the English conquered Jamaica, they want to make it a sugar plantation colony and a base for piracy.
Entonces, porque Jamaica se encontraba, por supuesto, muy cerca a Cuba. Cuba era la isla, el lugar donde pasaban todos los barcos, las rutas que pasaban por ahí. Ahí sobre todo pasaba el oro y la plata, ¿no? Que esas embarcaciones traían desde los diferentes lugares donde esas cosas se traían. Entonces, por eso los ingleses quieren ocupar, conquistar Jamaica, ¿no? Porque era el lugar ideal, punto ideal para controlar y robar, por supuesto.
So here is another look at Jamaica's location. You can see how close it is to Cuba. You can see its relationship in distance to ports like Portobello in Panama, which is the Portobello in Panama is the port where silver and gold mined from Potosi is being brought from Lima, shipped overland across the Panamanian Isthmus, deposited in Portobello, and that's where the fleet picks it up.
Al final el rey tuve que decir es que no podía quitar, no podía eliminar esta idea de privatización de la piratería, decimos así, porque como consecuencia podríamos decir la decadencia completa, ¿no? de esta realidad económica.
John,
Yes.
in this time, in this century, 20th century, this time, we can have a difference between the public and the private, no, in the modern state, no, in the institutional state, but in the early modern time, what is the meaning of the privacy? Because the public is the concept of the republic time. In this time, in early modern, exists the kingdom, no?
Yeah.
And kingdoms, the public is the crown, no? Who is the idea of the privacy, no? The private in this early modern time to, no? The historical process.
It is. I was going to make a point just to that question. When you think about the Crown, Charles II, when you think about the Royal African Company, this corporation, when you think about the Jamaican planters and merchants and the Jamaican legislature, and then you think of the privateers, the question is, who's in charge? Who really holds the power? What is the sovereign power? What is the public power? And the question is, are colonial governments really the sovereign power once authority leaves the shores of Britain? But then we see how the colonial governments themselves can't control the pirates either. So are these private citizens the actual sovereign power because they control the instruments of violence that make the state function and the economy prosper? So you boil that down and the big question is, how do you define sovereignty at this moment?
It's a very strong point. How can you define sovereignty?
Yeah.
How can you define sovereignty?
Oh, what is sovereignty? Okay. Who has the legitimate right to power?
¿Quién tiene el poder legítimo, no? Sí, el soberano es una pregunta, ¿no? It's a question about
Well, yeah, so sovereignty is legitimate power.
legitimate power.
So who is sovereign in this?
Situation.
Yeah. And who's sovereign in the empire? That's the question. Now here's another issue at stake. So remember, privateering was legal, right? The state had made piracy legal, calling it privateering, the official commission and so forth. Henry Morgan did not have a commission. He did not have legal permission from the crown to stage his raids.
El hecho es que, el hecho nuevo, la cosa que tenemos que subrayar es que Morgan no tenía ningún permiso, ¿no?, para hacer lo que está haciendo.
Yeah.
So
he is the classical pirate. He is the thief. He is the robber. He does not have the sanction of the state, yet when he comes back to Jamaica, he's a hero. He's made an admiral. Now,
Admiral, yes, Admiral.
okay, so I could tell you a lot about Morgan's other raids, but I'll focus on one because it's the most important. The Crown had finally negotiated a peace with Spain in 1670. And so what the Crown, what the state hopes for is that this peace with Spain will bring about the free trade in slaves.
Entonces, si la corona inglesa negoció un acuerdo con España en 1670, ¿sabes?
70, yeah.
1670.
But hold on for this.
Yes, one before.
Yeah. Okay, so in 1670, while that peace, the Treaty of Madrid, is negotiated and concluded, think about distance here, right? That's in Europe. We're talking about Jamaica here. The Jamaicans fear, or maybe it's just a pretext, maybe it's just an excuse, but the Jamaicans fear the Spanish are going to attack Jamaica. Now think about it. If the Spanish are going to attack Jamaica, your first move would be build up Jamaica's defenses.
Entonces, por favor, si Jamaica hubiera sido, ayúdame con...
Entonces los jamaiquinos, o sea, los británicos que estaban en la isla, tenían que construir un fuerte, ¿correcto? Tenían que protegerlo. Sí.
Right. Okay. What the Jamaicans do is they offer Morgan his own commission. Now the commissions are supposed to come from the king. Here's the governor of Jamaica, again giving a privateering commission to Morgan. And so Morgan sails away with his big fleet. As he's, halfway to his target, which is Panama City, Modiford receives from London word that the peace has been signed.
Entonces, lo que pasó es que Jamaica nombró, ¿no?, dio a Morgan el permiso, ¿no?, de lo que no tenía por debajo de la Inglaterra, lo tuvo por Jamaica, y también tuvo una flota, ¿no?, para moverse desde Jamaica hacia Panamá.
So, yeah.
I think that at the beginning you said that Miss Captain Morgan started as a privateer, right? I think.
Yes.
Privateering meaning that it's through state, right? It's orders from the crown and that they get a commission.
Mm-hmm.
But then at some point you said that Captain Morgan was not receiving any commission, but he was assaulting or he was robbing these Spaniard colonies, communities, okay?
Yeah.
And then you said that he was given a commission by the crown, so again, he's a privateer, I'm not a pirate, so he's between in the line, or...
His first raids, he's not a commander. He's like a lieutenant. And so his commander has the commission. His commander dies. That commission does not go to Morgan. It ends. But then Morgan kept on going into Yucatan, into Nicaragua, and so forth. Okay. Now, those commissions in 1662, 3, 4, those were from the king. In 1670, Morgan's commission comes from the governor. That's a legally questionable commission. The governors don't have sovereign power to give these commissions. Only the king really does. So the governor's taking it into his own power to do this. Hector.
In Caribbean, we have several Western powers, no? Dutch, French, Britain. And the piracy, no? The pirates is experience in Europe, in Mediterranean. What states, Britain, French, or Netherlands, who best relationship with pirates? The Britain, the French state, or the Dutch? Who is the best connection between this private economy and the royal economy?
Yeah.
The French, Dutch, or the Britain?
It's the British. Absolutely the British.
I have another question. Were the pirates, the pirates work because they were sponsored always by an empire, or maybe somebody who was left behind? It's not Captain Morgan's case, because at some point he had a British commander, right? Mm-hmm. And he was under that regiment. So yeah, or was there? Do you understand? Not working by for any empire, for any crown, but on its own,
very
on his
important.
own.
I'm going to get to that point.
Okay.
That's a very important point. So let me tell you about this last raid of Morgan's, and then that will bring your question. Okay, so Jamaica is going to be attacked by the Spanish, yet all of the military forces on Jamaica leave Jamaica to sail across the Caribbean to attack Panama. Does that make sense to you? Because it doesn't make sense to me, and it didn't make sense to lots of people in the empire. What seems to be the case is that the government of Jamaica, knowing that the peace was going to be concluded soon, gives Morgan permission to raid Panama for one last great privateering episode, right?
So, there's this.
The money that, after those riots, after, when they stole as pirates or as privateers, that money went to Jamaica, but that money went also to England or not? They remained in Jamaica. Because let's say here, I think it was most of the money, most of the abundance went to the crown, right? And we could not be as prosperous as there. And I think that in Jamaica, it was the opposite. It was, there were many goods, right? And were they all going there? Did they render accounts? No.
Yeah, this is, so let me talk about Panama and then, so what happens is when Morgan gets to the Panamanian coast, the city of Panama is on the Pacific side. So he takes 1,500 men in canoes up the River Chagres, and then when they can't canoe any farther, they march through the rainforest, being attacked by indigenous nations and runaway slaves. They run out of food, and by the time they reach Panama City, they are crazy. So when they get into Panama, and they pretty easily defeat the Spanish forces there, they are running amok, stealing as much as they can, rapes, torturing to find more gold. And it is just a horrific example of violence. Now, Morgan knew, he was informed, a ship from Jamaica caught up with him with the news that the peace had been signed, and he ignores it. You can't commit a privateering act in peacetime. It's a wartime weapon. It's wartime piracy. So this is, by the law of nations, a criminal act. This is out-and-out piracy. Charles II is furious because the new peace with Spain is jeopardized. But he also knows, and this gets to your question, all this gold, all this silver, and almost 1,000 slaves from this raid come back to Jamaica. What's happening is privateering, or piracy, is providing the foundation of capital for Jamaica's rise as a plantation colony. So the king wants Jamaica to be prosperous. He knows the privateers are a problem. He has to ultimately end it, but he's got to do it in a way that keeps the privateers on the side of the British. But he also has to convince the King of Spain that the peace is still intact, and he's going to crack down on Henry Morgan. So he has Morgan arrested, brought back to London in chains, imprisoned in the Tower of London for a couple months. The Spanish ambassador is informed of this. Lots of correspondence. Look how serious we are. We've captured this villain, and peace is going to flourish. And by the way, what about that free trade in slaves? Okay. So Spanish-Anglo relations cool down. And once that happens, Charles II makes Henry Morgan Sir Henry Morgan. He knights him. Sends him back to Jamaica as the lieutenant governor, where Morgan becomes one of the richest men in Jamaica, one of the most powerful politicians, and in many cases, someone who pursues his former comrades, his old pirate pals, and prosecutes them, and in some cases executes them.
Interesting history.
Now, Hector, how much time do we have left? Keep going? Okay. Well, the question is, for me, piracy obviously here is very important for the development of the British Empire. And if you think of the first British Empire, you think of Jamaica. Jamaica is the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. It's the richest colony of the empire. So the question is about piracy for me. Who were these pirates? Where did they come from? How did they come to be these violent thieves, if you will? What motivated them, beyond gold and silver, to do these things? And to get to that point, you've got to go back to Britain and Ireland and figure out how these pirates got to the Caribbean in the first place. And the way most of these pirates got to Barbados, Antigua, St. Kitts, and then Jamaica, most of them had been forced into the British Army and its invasion of Jamaica. Many of the first pirates were the survivors of the Western design. And as survivors on Jamaica, they were experiencing starvation, disease, no pay. They were being forced to labor for their officers. And they rebelled and they mutinied. And in the last soldier mutiny, one of their demands was, let us become privateers. So that's one faction of the pirates. Another faction are indentured servants who ran away from their plantations to join the privateers. How did these indentured servants get to Jamaica or Barbados or any of these other islands? Yesterday we talked about indentured servitude as a punishment for poor people or rebels or criminals in Britain and Ireland who the state would send to the colonies to become workers on plantations, right? And we talked about how these indentured servants were made forms of property. These indentured servants considered themselves to be a form of slaves, a kind of slave. So the two major sources for the pirates, the experiences that led to men choosing to become pirates at this time, was having been forced to fight in the army, forced to fight in the navy, or forced to work on plantations in a condition that they considered slavery. Mutiny, rebellion, running away. All of these were forms of resistance to forced labor. So resisting conscription, resisting the state forcing you onto a plantation. These were ways that people who had been made unfree became free. And what was important for them was to remain free. How do you remain free in a Caribbean world that forces poor people into different kinds of labor? How do you preserve that freedom? You organize your own piratical society called the Buccaneers. They call themselves also the Brethren of the Coast. You need to.
Yes, this is a passage, una nueva idea, ¿no? Que se constituyó después que los antiguos, decimos lo que antes se llamaba, lo que eran esclavos, o de alguna manera utilizados como obreros en las plantaciones y como servían en otras situaciones, intentaron reaccionar a esta situación huyendo, como está escrito aquí, ¿no? O con mutines, Pero ¿cómo podían resolver esta situación? ¿Cómo podían haber una forma para sobrevivir, ¿no? Y a esta situación de rebelión, ¿no? Y entonces una nueva organización que ellos llamaron de los bucaneros, ¿no? Ellos mismos, debajo de esa nueva forma, de ese nuevo estilo de hacer piratería, que ellos mismos llamaron Brethren of the Coast, ¿no? El aliento, ¿cómo se podría decir? El aliento de la costa, ¿no? Brethren of the Coast. Sí, algo así.
So,
¿no? Brethren of the Coast.
so the word buccaneer, where does that come from? It's actually, its origins are in Dino-Indian technology of cooking. Barbacoa, barbecue, right? The barbecue is the method. The grill is called a bucan. So what happens is, a lot of these servants, a lot of these sailors, a lot of these soldiers, before they became pirates, would escape into the interior of Jamaica, or they'd row away from their original island and they'd end up on Saint Domingue or Tortuga. And there was such a large population of feral cattle and hogs that they could make. Think of how hungry these people are, right? Think they've been deprived of basic necessities. Here, they can become hunters. They can have protein for the first time in their lives. But they can also, after they've barbecued on the bucan, sell the surplus to passing merchant ships, and they can gain a cash income too.
First way of trading.
Yes.
Primera manera de hacer comercio, ¿no?
So what are they trading for? They want tobacco to smoke, they want kill devil or rum to drink, and they want state-of-the-art muskets and ammunition. And what they discover, because imagine how tough, strong these guys are. What they discover eventually is they don't have to trade. They can take. Because no one can beat them in a fight. Now the society they form is defined against the plantation societies they escaped from.
Y al final la sociedad que ellos formaron se puede definir como una sociedad que estaba completamente a la oposición de la sociedad de la que se huyeron, que era la sociedad de las plantaciones, ¿no? De las plantaciones de...
All the brothers were equal. The wealth that was stolen through piracy equally distributed among the community. They formed codes of honor and conduct and law, I guess you could say, to resolve disputes. And they also elected for every expedition their own commanders.
Entonces una sociedad basada sobre la igualdad de todos los miembros, donde la riqueza se distribuía de manera igual y donde el comandante de cada expedición se nombraba entre ellos mismos, ¿no?
So buccaneers could conduct piracy for themselves they ultimately realized there might be 1,500, maybe 2,000 buccaneers at a time. It's a pretty large force, but ultimately they know they cannot remain free in a sea of empires. They will be crushed. So what they do is they negotiate their military service with different empires, almost always Britain. Sometimes the Dutch, sometimes the French, but almost always Britain.
When you say negotiate?
They make a deal. They make a deal. It's on their terms.
That is money.
Yeah. So it's not like the British are saying, the Buccaneers, you will serve us. The Buccaneers are offering their services, and the British are taking those services on the terms the Buccaneers are offering. So the Crown gets a 10% cut. The merchants get their cut. And then the Buccaneers get the rest. But the merchants of Jamaica make out the best from this deal financially. Because what do pirates do when they come back to port? What do? They drink and they party and they spend all this loot bulging in their pants pockets in about a week. And so when they're out of cash, and if they don't want to go hunt, they volunteer for another piratical expedition. So this is a way, piracy, buccaneering, was a way for the unfree to live free through thievery. I mean, it's when they're in Panama, they are tying cords around people's heads and pulling them so tight their eyeballs are bulging out to make them to make them tell where the gold is good. They're stretching victims out on racks, separating their limbs from their bodies, to torture. So I don't want to romanticize this. I mean, this is a quest for freedom. It's a equal democratic brotherhood, but they're pirates too. And let's look at this from the British state perspective. Empire and capital always win in history. It's gloomy, I hate saying it, but I think it's historically true. Doesn't mean we don't stop fighting. But here's why capital and empire persevere in history. They adapt. They adapt to present circumstances. Remember, these buccaneers had been indentured servants that the state had forced into labor. They had been soldiers who had been forced into labor, sailors who had been forced into labor. Then they escaped. They resisted. They rebelled. They mutinied. They became pirates. And when they become pirates, what do? They offer their services to the empire.
It's a circle.
Yeah. So what was unfree labor and resistance to it becomes free labor, paid labor, working for the state against their enemies. And the money that's brought in through this new free labor is making Jamaica the wealthiest colony in the empire. Okay, you may need to translate this. I think Hollywood should not hire script writers. They should hire historians, because we know the best stories. You can't make this up. How strange and ironic this circuit of freedom to unfreedom is. And then all of the dramatic stories of these buccaneering expeditions. and the historical significance of this is what we should be watching on the next group and learning about. Because it's not only entertaining, it's real, and it's really important.
Habéis entendido, ¿no? Que dice sobre las películas que todos conocemos, ¿no? De Hollywood sobre los piratas, los bucaneros, pero no, nunca se ha visto este problema desde este punto de vista así complejo y muy interesante desde el punto de vista histórico y...
Truth is stranger than fiction.
Yes.
Okay, so en español, co-optation?
Co-Optation of resistance, obligación, ¿no? Una obligación de... ¿Cómo se puede traducir Co-Optation? Una forma de cooptar a la resistencia, es decir, render obligatoria. No, ¿cómo se puede decir?
Maybe I can explain in English and then you explain in Spanish. Okay.
Yes, use other words.
So by co-optation,
Cooptar
Coaccionar la resistencia del bucanero, ¿no? Que los bucaneros proveen.
I'm sorry, what is
Co-Optation.
that's what we're trying to say. Okay, so this is a very important concept. Let's say, my 10-year-old daughter doesn't want to wash the dishes. And I say, wow, children who do their chores become successful adults because, so what I've done is I've co-opted her. I haven't coerced her. I've co-opted her into doing what I want her to do.
To convince.
To convince. To get, yeah. But co-opt is more because it sort of brings people into a system that they would resist normally, but they nonetheless participate.
Can it be something like mercenario? No?
I don't know what mercenary.
The idea of this is another way of defining soldiers that were laboring the Adriatic Sea. We had this kind of way of paying people. It's a bit difficult also for me to explain the idea.
Co-optation is getting people to work for you. It's getting people to work for you who don't want to work for you without coercion.
Promising something, but how can you convince them? Promising or...
But it's different because the British aren't like going out and recruiting. They are coming to the British. So what the British are doing is they're turning it around. They're turning a possible enemy into an ally. Okay, we'll just keep going.
Yes.
Okay.
Better.
All right. Okay.
Going on.
So how do these unfree rebels who become pirates, how do they then become part of the imperial system again? Right? And then what services do they provide as pirates for the empire and for capital? Well, here they are. Pirates are military labor. In the privateering capacity, they're military labor for the empire. I mean, Spain is Britain's arch rival in the Caribbean. All these attacks on Panama, Puerto Príncipe, Nicaragua, Merida, Gibraltar, and modern-day Venezuela, these are all attacks at the heart of the Spanish Empire as the British Empire is trying to increase its power. So these pirates are like soldiers in a way. Also, when the Buccaneers are in port, when they're at Jamaica, they form part of the colonial militia. So if there's an attack on Jamaica, they can guard it. There's another service that's provided here. These soldiers who mutinied on Jamaica, you don't want them around all the time because they're troublemakers. If you can get them out of Jamaica for long periods of time where they might die, or they're going to come back not necessarily troublemakers, but like with lots of gold and slaves. Okay? Now, speaking of slaves, the trade in slaves is not just an arrow on a map showing where people are enslaved and then they're brought a different place. That commerce is on ships, and ships are machines, and you need workers to run machines. These pirates who were stealing slaves and transporting them across the Caribbean are in effect slave ship sailors. The labor necessary to deliver unfree labor to the plantation is one of the most important labor forms in the Atlantic world.
Yes. So let's consider another labor source, the fact that there is an exchange of slaves between the different colonies.
You need workers to do the exchange. Okay. Tris. So all that gold and silver that the pirates are bringing back to Jamaica, it's being invested in plantations, it's being invested in slave trading enterprises, it's being invested in all the different economic enterprises that make a colony flourish. Because Jamaica starts producing things like sugar, cacao, tobacco, indigo, cotton, mostly sugar, but there's other goods too. It becomes a very attractive market for other colonies in the British Empire. So in exchange for Jamaican goods, merchants from New England and the Chesapeake are coming to Jamaica to trade. But they're also coming to Jamaica not just to exchange goods, they're coming to Jamaica to sell goods from New England or the Chesapeake because they want that Jamaican gold and they want that Jamaican silver because these other colonies are very short of currency. They don't have currency to exchange on the global market. So that gold and silver that ends up in Jamaica circulates all over the British Empire and enables merchants and planters and farmers all over the British Empire to obtain real currency, real bullion, to purchase goods, right?
So gold and silver converts in the currency, the new currency.
When you have a convertible currency, your entree into the global economy becomes more efficient and more profitable. So the stolen gold and silver from Spain becomes the currency that makes the British Empire work as a commercial and economic unit in the late 17th century.
Una pregunta, another question?
Yes, I have. So after the peace between England and Spain, so Spain wasn't robbed, wasn't privateered. But what did Spain win? Only not being robbed? What did Spain win with that pact?
With the war, the Treaty of Madrid, 1670, Spain loses more than it gets. Spain is forced to recognize Jamaica as a British colony, which it never did before. And the Spanish are forced to recognize that a free trade in slaves, while not formally permitted, can be conducted in certain circumstances. What that really means is that trade in slaves is going to really start. It's diplomatic cover. And so what happens in Jamaica when the Treaty of Madrid is signed and this opening for the trade in slaves between British and Spanish colonies begins? The Royal African Company, right, the slave trading corporation, makes Jamaica its base. So Jamaica becomes a base for piracy. It becomes primarily a sugar plantation colony, but it also becomes a slave trading center. It's not just a place where slaves come to work. It's a place where slaves come to be sold to other places. So all these economic forces, which are brought into being in part through piracy, are making the political economy of capitalism a rapid, profit-making, political power-producing system.
That found its apex in Jamaica.
Yeah. Jamaica is the best example. Okay, so I'll just conclude with this. The history of piracy and privateering and buccaneering makes us wonder, what is the nature of sovereignty? Who has the power, really, in the Caribbean in the 17th century? It also brings our attention to a discourse, an economic discourse in free trade. So the origins of our global capitalist discourse in free trade are embedded in the history of slave trading, and piracy is a major feature of that. We see how the state, through its own power, can transform that something criminal into something that's legal for its own benefit. We see how piracy emerges from a labor history of forced labor in the military and the plantation, and that piracy is in many ways a resistant response to those forms of unfree labor. And so we see these resistant, unfree workers self-organizing, creating their own societies that they define against imperial society. But we also see how these self-organized societies need to bargain, they need to make deals with empires to survive. And we see how empire and capital are very resilient, very good at transforming threats into assets, into strengths, when we study the history of piracy. Okay?
La conclusión, ¿cuál es? ¿Cuál es la conclusión el resumen, ¿no? El hecho interesante que ya hemos visto hace poco, ¿no? Que como algo que ¿sí? La conclusión es como algo que sale de manera violenta, ilegal, y después se convierte en una rebelión, ¿no? En una forma de reacción que se convierte en algo nuevo, en algo que está constituido de forma regular otra vez. Entonces los rebeldes que se constituyen en una asociación se forman como una realidad nueva que es importante para los imperios, para las potencias, ¿no? Para los poderes, ¿no? Imperialistas. Y entonces es muy interesante ver cómo desde una situación de falta de libertad se convierte en una realidad nueva, donde tienen importancia, donde tienen una forma de comerciar y de tratar, ¿no? con los reyes, con los emperadores, ¿no? Y al final también, pero llegar a pactos con ellos, ¿no? Y volver a ser algo que los hace a mitad de esclavos, ¿no? O de manera dependiente de ellos también, ¿no? Sí, eso es, creo, interesante como the word entangle, ¿no? Entangle is of resistance, and so it's sort of twisted, no?
Yeah.
Story that starts from in the hour of complete slavery, and then rebellion, and then freedom, and then but never free, no, at the end.
John, for history it's very important the source. The pirate society, the Buccaneer society is an official society, no? I think you'd like to know how to the oldest written source in Jamaica is the crown, is the piracy, the written contracts, or this is oral society. No, for example, the Buccaneer and the pirate society. This is the source, the official source, or there are Buccaneer source.
Oh, I see.
No, who is the connection between the official
Right.
and the history, the own Buccaneers. And this is oral against the writing source, or the Buccaneer as writing source.
So the question of sources, when you're trying to study basically a criminal society, like how do we know the Buccaneers were the way I described them? They don't have their own archive, right? They didn't have officials writing down records of their exploits. Although that's not exactly true. Many Buccaneer captains who tried to, and these were sort of, these were men who had kind of elite backgrounds, right? Who became some of the commanders. Or they were at least educated and knew how to write. Several of them, Bartholomew Sharp, Lionel Wafer, and William Dampier. So that's 3. All left books about their experiences. The problem in terms of sources for these books, they don't talk much about the robbing and the pillaging. They talk more about map making, charting currents, sketching images of coastlines. Basically what it is it's information and intelligence that they can sell to merchant captains and the state itself. But there is one very important book written by a Buccaneer. And this Buccaneer's name was Alexander Exquemelin. And his book was called The Buccaneers of America, published in 1684. And if you want these, I can send them to you. This is the real account from the bottom of how these expeditions happen. I mean, he's talking about the torture. And he's talking about Henry Morgan, like what he was like in real life. So this is an absolutely critical source.
Reference, the only reference we have.
Well, yeah, it's the only first-hand account by a Buccaneer that takes us into the heart of the Buccaneering Society. But what we can also do, though, and this is what historians who study the working class, historians who study non-elites, historians who study people on the margins, they have to read official records against the intent for which they were written. So when you see, for example, a planter writing to the governor of Jamaica saying, "My servants keep running away to join the Buccaneers," as an historian, I read that and say, here are servants saying, "I don't want to work on a plantation because it's brutal. I want to live free, and if I become a pirate, I can do that." So what is a planter's complaint about unruly servants for the historian becomes evidence of resistance, right?
Personal experiences that are told.
Yeah.
I haven't understood, sorry, to ask you a question about the last sentence.
Oh, this one.
Point.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, the making of whites.
Yeah. This is one that I'm still thinking through a lot. I'm not sure about it, but I think it's an important idea. So, ethnically, Buccaneers were mostly English, French, and Dutch, but large majority were English. But you also have Mosquito Indians and a smaller population of runaway African slaves. So, in a way, the Buccaneers' brotherhood was multi-ethnic, multi-racial, but white-dominated. When the Buccaneers are stealing slaves and selling them in Jamaica or in other colonies, here we have mostly white men resisting their forced labor, becoming free, and using that freedom to gain gold by enslaving others. Now, they're not capitalists. They're not going to take the gold and invest it in a sugar plantation. They're going to drink it up. But still, if you think of that transition from bondage to freedom that the pirates make, that freedom will depend in part on a slave trade. What it tells me is that even the most marginalized white people in the Caribbean had opportunities to really become white, which means have some kind of power. In fact, you could say, when they're on a plantation working as indentured servants, they may look like me, but what we mean by whiteness in terms of privilege, freedom, opportunity, etc., they don't have it. But when they become pirates, they're gaining access to those privileges and that status. So I mean, I think there's an argument to be made there, but I think I need to explore it in more depth before I really commit to it.
Yeah, so when you speak about whiteness, it's a wide word. It doesn't imply cultural or racial element only, but the
Right.
possibility to reach a wealthier situation
Yeah.
than before.
Not white as in skin color, white as in a social condition, a social status.
Creo que esto es también interesante, ¿no? Este concepto de blanco, ¿no? Que no es simplemente un hecho racial, pero una manera de subir de nivel, ¿no? Ganando.
In Spanish, in colonial Spanish, decían cartas al sacar. Es decir, in the whole day for the Spain, now I am white. So this is similar in colonial America, Hispanic America.
Yes, the idea of whiteness in this way is.
Muchas gracias.